we'll make a start. Good evening, everybody, and depending on where you are in the world, good afternoon or even good morning for some of us. Welcome to our 6th episode looking at how skill acquisition is being applied in different domains. Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland is comprised of Ed Collin, Phil Carney, Alan Dunton, and myself, Ollie Logan, and we are passionate about skill acquisition, coaching science, and youth development. And we hope that by hosting these webinars, we're able to connect you with some of the leading figures in these respective areas. For those of you that are in the webinar on Zoom, please keep yourselves on mute. And if you do have questions, please put those in the chat box, which on my screen is just down there. And we'll come to you either during or at the end of the presentation. And if you're watching us on YouTube live, then please put your questions in the comments box. Otherwise, if you're watching on catch up, then you can put reflections or comments in there, and we may pick those up at a later date. So I'll hand over to Phil to introduce today's guest. Phil.
Thanks, Ollie. Absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Shane Pill from Flinders University. When we were looking for speakers to come in from different domains, we were talking about the crossover between coaching and particularly secondary school physical education. Shane immediately came to mind, both in terms of the range of books that he has produced across a number of different topics. Most recently, things like the Spectrum of Coaching Styles, which is coming out shortly, but also in terms of his blog, which always includes lots of thoughtful pieces. This was our very much target speaker to bring in, and so we're absolutely delighted that he agreed to join us. And without further ado, because I'm really keen to get into the content, I'm going to pass you over to Professor Pill.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this event today. I'm joining you from Ghana land today. I live in Adelaide, South Australia. I recognise the Ghana people's continued relationship and responsibility to the lands and waters that constitute the Adelaide Plains. Pay my respects to the elders, past, present. This land always was and always will be Ghana land. My topic today is skill acquisition in physical education. I'd like to start by saying I'm not a sports scientist. In preparing for this presentation, I remember probably my 2nd year at Teachers College. So yes, I'm old enough to have done a physical education degree before it became a university degree. So my 2nd year at Teachers College, this new thing called sports science degree started, and they struggled to get enough people to make a cohort. So they were pleading with the physical education cohort, of which there were plenty. Physical education, to get into physical education, had the highest tertiary admittance score of any subject. So you had to be academically capable, which we were told often. And you also had to go through a test of capability, from the sense that you needed to have a reference from your school to indicate how many sports you had played and to what level. So it wasn't just a matter of what academic score you got, it was also therefore a measure of what your, I guess, capability was, because I came through an era where you shouldn't ask the kids to do something you couldn't do yourself. So my 1st year at Teachers College, we did basketball as our opening unit of work with Alan Launder of Play Practice fame. And I'd never done basketball at school. Physical education at school was pretty much the main sports that you played for school. So it wasn't this try lots of things and hopefully you find something that you like and then you'll decide to pursue it. Physical education was a lot of repeating what was available through the school sports. So we come to our assessment and we had to get 60% from the free throw line for our set shots. And I got 50%, so I had to come back and do a supplementary assessment the following week on basketball set shots. Today, with our physical education teachers, it's much more about the pedagogy and can you teach, whereas the era that I came through was very different from what I will talk about as my understanding of best practice in physical education. But I think the common thread that's run through it all is the importance of skill acquisition, even though we might talk differently about the idea of best practice of that skill acquisition. I tell all my students at Flinders University, you can't be a quality physical education teacher without good knowledge of 2 things. The first one is biomechanics, because as a physical education teacher, you need to be a student of the body in motion. to understand the body in motion and how to help that body become more, I'll use the 2 E's, efficient and effective. You need to be able to watch that body in motion in order to know the conversations that you'll have with that individual to help them become more efficient and effective. And by doing so, help their competence, which will provide them with the confidence to pursue physical activity. So having those 2 E's to help with the biomechanics, you then have to understand skill acquisition theory to know how to work with the individual in order to help them improve those 2 E's of efficiency and effectiveness. So that's a little bit of an introduction to me and where I situate myself, still very much as a physical education teacher. 18 years as a teacher, now 16 years as an accidental academic. I became an accidental academic because I wanted to get off of the principal pathway. I didn't like being in an office all day. An opportunity came up at Flinders University to work in teacher education, decided to have a go, won the position, took 2 years off leave without pay to try it out, and now I've been there for 16 years, but still longer a teacher than I have been an academic. I've also been sports coaching now, maths is not my strong point, 35 years. Coached my first sports team in 1987. I've coached from under 8 through to semi-professional adult sport. And tonight, it's 6 a.m. in the morning here tonight, got a trial game for the women's football team that I'm coaching this year at community level football. And I'm also involved as an assistant coach at state league level in women's football in South Australia as well. So today's presentation, I'm going to cover a little bit of what physical education is and where skill acquisition fits into that construct. We're looking at how the curriculum develops and therefore where skill acquisition fits in that curriculum development, what educational theories underpin the educative purpose of most physical education curriculums, the idea that for teachers, perhaps more so than coaches, but maybe for coaches as well, I believe that many of the models of practice oversimplify the notion of teaching, which is complex, and finishing off with a vision of what the physically educated person is, because that's where our skill acquisition is focused. First topic, what is physical education? In Australia and elsewhere, for around about 30 years, physical education has been influenced by the work of Peter Arnold. Peter Arnold suggested that unlike maybe sport coaching and physical activity provision in community settings such as gyms, physical education cuts across 3 interrelated knowledge domains. The first knowledge domain is what we call education in movement. Education in movements is working in the physical domain of learning or the psychomotor domain of learning. It's the education for technical and tactical movement competency. It's the ability to work so that the person becomes a more skillful mover. Education through movement, that second area is looking at what some people have called the valued ends of physical activity. If we put it into a sport context, in schools, sport has a strong tradition because not only is it valuable for the development of healthy bodies, but it's also valuable because of the interpersonal and intrapersonal skills that are developed. Through a focus on character development, we can see persistence, resilience, optimism. We can see teamwork, cooperation, the ability to work towards common goals, things that are valued in adult life to be able to succeed in the workplace. So sport, as part of physical education, is not just about developing for the player. This education through movement is the development of that person's personal and social competencies. And the third area, education about movement, is where skill acquisition, biomechanics, sociology would fit in, because ultimately what we're hoping for at the end of physical education is that the individual knows enough to be self-motivated and self-determined towards their physical activity pursuits. So we have to bring them along a journey where they understand the construct of how to be skillful so that they're able to take self-motivated self-direction in their adult life to pursue lifelong physical activity. Arnold had a really nice diagram to show all of those interrelated dimensions, which I've shared on the screen there. But the focus of this integrated 3 dimensions is the preeminence of skill, recognizing that ultimately physical education is unique in subjects in school because the subject is movement and helping people become more capable and competent movers. Despite the fact that physical education's focus is on the preeminence of skill, when we look at an Arnoldian perspective of physical education as education in, through and about movement, there's a lot of evidence that today, globally, we now have intergenerational absence of movement competence. Research from the 1990s started to raise concern that young people weren't achieving the movement competencies that previous generations were attaining. Part of that was due to changes in the urban environment, where there was less availability to be active. Part of that was changes in schooling and a focus on, I'll use the word academics in the broadest sense. So when I went to school, Wednesday lunchtime, school would finish in terms of math, science, English, and we would go off and we would play sport. We had weekend sports because I went to an independent Catholic school, but we all went off and played squash at the local squash club, windsurfing down the beach, bowls at the bowls club, because it was seen as a useful thing to encourage physical activity into the community. But as people started to test numeracy and test literacy, and those scores started to become more publicly available, and schools started to get ranked against international averages, people went, to be competitive, we need to find more time to put into our literacy, our numeracy, our scientific pursuits. That time's got to come from somewhere because there is a mandated number of hours in the school days. Inevitably, that time came from subjects like physical education. When I was starting my teaching career back in the mid-1980s, computers were just coming in, and similarly, schools were confronted with, where do we put these things called computers? Do we put them in classrooms and make them a resource? Or do we create a subject called computing and teach people how to use the computers in this subject? Inevitably, schools being schools, it was decided we'll put them in a room called a classroom and create a subject called computing. Well, that was time that had to come from somewhere. So things such as school sport during school time disappeared because of this curriculum pressure that continues to exist today, where people say, young people need these capabilities. Where do we find the time from? And people look at physical education and they go, oh, yeah, it looks like they're doing soccer out there. That's good fun. We've got a school soccer program. Why are they doing soccer in PE when those kids could be choosing to do soccer in the school program? Or they'll be going, there's a soccer club 500 metres down the road. What's educative about doing soccer in PE when there's a soccer club down the road that they could be doing that if the kids were really interested in it? So a big change that I've seen in physical education in the last 30 plus years that I've been teaching is this direction towards what is the educative purpose of physical education. Siedentop made the observation in the early 1970s that now physical education is not unique in developing education in, through and about movement, and depending upon the pedagogy and the curriculum that is planned, sometimes there is more education in, through and about movement at the local football club than what there is in a physical education setting. And that creates complications for those of us that work in the physical education space and continue to have to make claims for viability of our subject area as necessary in curriculum time. So we're in a period today where young people are generally regarded as less movement competent than previous generations. That's now intergenerational, where the parents of today's young people are on average less movement competent than their great-grandparents were movement competent. And for something like sport, the research is pretty clear that it's parents that induct kids into sport. 4 or 5-year-olds, most of them don't know that they want to play sport, they just want to play. And it's parents that take them to a version of play which is called sport. So if we don't have parents creating the environment at home with sidewalk, driveway, street, backyard, playground, forms of kick and catch, hit and run, introductions to forms of sport, then we don't have people coming to value that. If they just do it in physical education, then it'll be parked there as this is physical education. And when we leave physical education, we're done with it. If those ideas and activities are not being replicated at home in the community, then children will park it. We only need it when we go to PE. So some research that Stephen Harvey and I did of review of movement competence research from 1997 to 2017, which is an open access journal, summarises the extensive literature. It's probably the most researched area of physical education, this decline in movement competency that's been recorded in the literature extensively since the late 1990s. And what we come back to from this research is a fairly simple equation that if we want more people active more often, they need competence. Competence provides self-efficacy, or in other words, the confidence, whether that be perceived and actual or perceived or actual. Without competence, we find that people don't have the confidence to have the self-determination to seek to be physically active, which returns us back to that Arnoldian perspective that preeminence of skill, competence. Physical education needs to be providing competence if it's going to realise the ambition of providing the knowledge, understanding and capability for people to be physically active for life, which is where most physical education programs land on their reason for being. So having established the centrality of competence or the development of skill in physical education, I want to talk now about how the curriculum develops. It doesn't matter where we look globally and whatever curriculum that we look at, physical education curriculums globally follow a similar pattern. So some might argue there is only one pattern for physical education. There's different language for it. There's different theories that will use different nomenclature to explain it. But pretty much all physical education programs start with the development of fundamental or general movement ability. From that fundamental or general movement ability, we're looking at putting those skills into movement sequences. So from teaching people how to do an underarm throw and to track a ball and to pick a ball up off the ground, 3 discrete fundamental movement skills, we then start to expect that they're able to put that into a sequence. They track a ball, they trap a ball, they throw it to a target, whether that target be a pair of cricket stumps or it be an individual in a game of netball. That's not to say that the introduction to the movement teaching is done in isolation where everybody stands in a line and throws the ball to each other to practice underarm throwing. It's not out of context. In fact, we encourage play-based and game-based learning. It's just that through that game-based, play-based learning in the early years, we are developing those fundamental movement capabilities. And as that individual becomes more experienced through growth and development and maturation, they become more capable, we expect to see development of that towards more consistent coordination and competency in those games that we play. And then we start to expect that the physical education curriculum will refine those general or fundamental movement capabilities into specialized skills for application in recognized pursuits. To give an example, we might start with dynamic balance as a fundamental movement skill, walking across balance beams, walking across ropes, etc. That dynamic balance might progress to a scooter board, where we're lying on our chest on a board and moving around the room in space. May progress to the specialized skill of riding a skateboard or riding a bike or riding a surfboard. It's still dynamic movement ability, but it's now specialized to a pursuit. from the application of those movement skills as specialized skills in sports and other physical activity domains. We then move to the ability to apply and transfer our understanding so that we can help others and ourselves be more self-determined with our movement capability. And then finally in the curriculum, we're looking at the transfer of that knowledge, skill, and understanding to be able to develop personalized plans for physical activity, to be able to coach others, to be able to take distinct roles within a community of practice such as sport. Again, I want to emphasize that that's a generic way that the curriculum develops from entry point, which would be for us grade 4-5, through to the end of compulsory physical education, which in Australia would be grade 10. The key point is that all curriculums have coherent complexity, where there is progression from simple to complex over time. As a former science teacher, to give an analogy, we teach cell theory in grade 4-5, reception grade 1s. All living things are made of cells, all non-living things are not. This idea of cell theory is taught every year in the curriculum, developing in complexity, developing in substance, expansion of the theory. It's not something that we just teach once and then leave behind. And it's the same in the physical education curriculum. We start with this notion that there are generalized movement skills, and we continue to progress those capabilities through coherent complexity year by year through the curriculum. The big shift that's occurred in the understanding of the curriculum, and therefore the role of teachers in my time, is a move from what we describe as behaviorist understanding, where the student is a replicator of the demonstration and explanation of the teacher. And the closer the approximation of that replication of the demonstration and the explanation to what the teacher provided, the more capable the student was seen. So we've moved from this behaviorist understanding of education, not just in physical education, but in education generally. I've got this great picture from the early 1900s where everybody's got their chalkboard out and the teacher has put a picture of a cat. So the students aren't asked to draw a cat, they are asked to draw that cat. So there's no understanding of what makes a cat a cat. They just have to draw this, and the closer the drawing to what the teacher has put, the better they are at drawing a cat. That's the same idea that we had in physical education. You have to replicate the demonstration, the visual presentation that the teacher had provided, and the better you do that, the better you are in physical education. So we moved from that, which is how I was trained also as a teacher, to this constructivist idea of education. And the constructivist idea of education is that learning is complex. We would describe the behaviorist understanding that learning is complicated. In order to get to that picture of a cat, we break it down into segments, and we put the segments together like building a single wall of Lego bricks, one after the other. So there is that brick by brick progression in the building. We would call that complicated learning. Constructivist understanding is that learning is complex because we're dealing with humans, and no human is the same. No human has experienced the world the same way. No human sees the world the same way. So therefore, we're still trying to build what generically we might call motor programs or motor ability or skill. But the way we go about it is we ask, what can that individual do? How can we help them to be able to do it better? What are they actually able to do? Because that body is going to be different to other bodies. So in helping the individual to construct their movement ability, we start with where the individual is at. So the idea that, we start where the individual at, we actually need to do some, I'll use the term very generally, pre-testing, in order to build a profile of where the learner is at in order to help them be progressed on the curriculum continuum into the future. Without an understanding of where the student is at, we're only guessing on what they need for their physical education, and guessing is not good enough in order to build people along the continuum of achievement. That leads us into a whole different discussion on differentiated pedagogy, which is not part of the opportunity today. But the key thing is that we're building the skill capability of children by experience. And those experiences may need to be different in a physical education class because we've got different starting points. We've got 28 children in the class. We can't manage 28 different starting points in the time we've got available. So we tend to go, roughly, where are these groups of students on the continuum of achievement? We might use our traffic lights, for example, and the not yets are the red lights over here. They will need a different entry point to our ambers, who are about where we would expect to be at this point in time, to our green lights, who are advanced of where the average person would be expected to be in the continuum. They need a different entry point. So constructivism leads us to move away from this behaviourist, everybody doing the same thing at the same time to the same endpoint, to understanding that we're helping the individuals improve tomorrow from where they are today. We are still representing the context of learning to each of those three groups that I've described, but the level of complexity that those individuals would start within that representation would necessarily be different because they're at different challenge points. We can then look to describe the pedagogical actions within a constructivist approach, and therefore a quality physical education program, as the educative purpose. The educative purpose comes back to that Arnoldian perspective that we have those three interrelated knowledge dimensions of education: in movement, through movement, and about movement. It's strengths-based because we are starting with the ability of that individual. So the individual is seen as capable. The question is, where are they at in their capability? Whereas the behaviourist approach is working from a deficit point of view. They are not capable. I need to put that capability into place. Constructivist is a strengths-based perspective, asking, where is that individual at, so that I can help them be more competent tomorrow than where they are today. It's valuing movement because that is the distinctiveness of physical education, that movement is our key for the educative purpose. And as that Arnoldian perspective emphasised, we are wanting the people to be more skillful in the future as a result of our intervention, which we call physical education. And finally, we're not just working in the physical domain of learning. We are working across the cognitive, the physical, the social, emotional domains of learning in physical education, because we're educating an individual who works across all of those domains of learning, as they do in all subject areas. In order to get into the cognitive domain of learning, and indeed into the social emotional, we need to ask questions about that. And indeed, we ask questions about their physical domain of learning. So we're trying to create an inquiry and student thinking, because it's constructing the student as the more capable learner, which means the student needs to be helped in their understanding of how to learn, where they are, where their gaps are, how they can fill those gaps, improve those gaps, be better tomorrow than what they are today, and working towards their capacity to be self-determined and self-motivated. That's not going to happen if the teacher is coming in providing all of the answers, all of the explanations. So we call that creating inquiry and a thinking curriculum. Within that, in the sport and games focus area, recognising that sport and games is only one of about 8 focus areas of a physical education curriculum. Game-based approaches have become popularised progressively over the last 30 years because they teach for understanding, and that fits in very nicely with that thinking, creativity and inquiry perspective, which is one of the focuses of the constructivist curriculum. And specifically, the game-based approaches provide 2 tools for the physical education teacher. They provide for student problem solving. because the capacity to solve problems is the demonstration of the thinking. It's part of the creation of the inquiry. It's part of the development of the creativity. The second part of it is game-based approaches provide a pedagogical toolkit which puts the players as the constructors rather than the replicators. And the key pedagogical tool for that is asking questions in preference to, and I use the phrase in preference to, because it's not a versus approach where asking questions is great, providing instructions is wrong. But it's in preference to providing instructions, we seek to ask questions to create the student as an inquirer. In my own work, I put it as a non-linear pedagogy, which I call play with purpose, because the play has purpose. One of the errors that I found is that teachers often think we can just let kids play. Somehow, by osmosis, they'll figure things out. That might happen for some, but my understanding of the literature, my own experience would say when most people go and play, they play within their existing toolkit. They don't develop a new toolkit unless they start to think. Now, some kids will be in that play environment and they'll start to think, how is that child doing that? I want to be able to do that. So they're actually providing cognitive organization and direction to where they want to go. But again, we don't know which kids will do that and which children will just play within their toolkit. So if we have this thing called a teacher there, the role of the teacher is to help everybody move towards greater capability. So therefore, the play needs to be intentional, deliberate, which I call, we play with purpose. Now, in a physical education setting, exactly the same as what I would as a sports coach. That first play period, I would use as retrieval practice. By retrieval practice, I mean I want the players to come in and use their existing toolkit. I'm going to sit back and do the assessment piece. Are the players where I think they should be, where I'm expecting them to be at this time point? If they're not, then through the inquiry, some or all may need to go into some form of practice, or through my inquiry, I've been able to shape and focus their thinking and see whether that leads to an improved performance when they go out and play. So it's a non-linear approach in the sense that after we play and we have an inquiry period, I could go back to the game. I could go into practice. From the practice, I could go back into the play. Or from the practice, I could go into an elevated challenge point. From the inquiry, it could be that the students are ready to go to the next challenge point and we go into the next gameplay, which is where we put them into the stretch, where we're trying to improve their capability. So it's an elevated challenge point. And then we're back into the inquiry. Do we practice? Do we go back to play? Generally, though, I think that many of the models that teachers and sports coaches are directed towards from a pedagogical perspective complicate, perhaps, but certainly simplify their understanding of what teaching is. So in this next part of the presentation, I'll talk about why I see many of the models from skill acquisition in particular that are put in front of people simplifying from a pedagogical perspective teaching, which is actually a very complex process. And I say that because when we read the literature about many models, we get the impression that they are a teaching style. A game-based approach is a discovery teaching style. When in fact there are, what's that there? Maths is not my strong point. 11 teaching styles there. If we look at Mostyn's idea of a continuum or a cluster of teaching styles, we can see that depending upon the level of construction of the teacher or the coach into the learning episode, we can have more or less student-centeredness or player-centeredness. But at the heart of it, again, we're constructing a learning episode because the task that we are choosing, matched with the pedagogy for that task, is there for a desired learning outcome for the individual. So the mastery of the teacher or the coach is the deliberate selection of pedagogy for the student to get the task outcome which is envisaged from that learning environment. So a game-based approach is not necessarily discovery learning from the perspective of the spectrum of teaching style. The skill of a teacher or a coach is what we call mobility ability within that spectrum to move both within a lesson and across lessons, this spectrum, depending upon the teaching episode and where they are in the teaching episode. And I'll explain that. If I go back to my idea of play with purpose, and some physical education teachers might like to do a warm-up before we get into our first play engagement. If the teacher leads that warm-up, well, that's command style A, where the teacher is making all of the decisions, is pacing the students, they're under the timing control, the instructional control of the teacher. And then the teacher gives them some instructions about how to play the first game. Well, that's still command style because the teacher is telling them how to do it. The teacher then lets them go out and play. Now, the pacing of the practice is under the control of the student. So that would be practice style. Teacher calls them in, does some inquiry episode with some questions which are converging towards an answer that the teacher wants the students to get. Part of the complexity here is unless we've done some pre-testing, we don't know whether these questions are targeting something which is unknown to the students and is therefore genuinely discovery because the students are creating new understanding, or whether it's application of existing knowledge. So therefore it's retrieval practice. The other complication is if we ask a student a question and they provide the answer, even if everybody else didn't know that answer, they've just heard it. So it's no longer discovery for everybody else because they've just heard the answer from one of the students. But let's assume that the inquiry is a convergent style of questioning towards the answer that the teacher is hoping to get, and that answer is new understanding for the students. Once they've been through that, well, they're now either going to practice, which would be practice style, or they're going to go and play, having been shaped and focused in their thinking. So they're retrieving that thinking in their practice. That's still practice style. That's not discovery, because the coaches come in with information that has provided cognitive organization, has provided cognitive direction. So therefore, they are practicing according to that shaping and focusing that has just been explained. And then to finish off with, the teacher might put them into some form of warm down or some form of task to consolidate their learning, like an exit card. And that, again, that's under the instruction of the teacher. So it would be a command style pedagogy. So what I'm presenting there is that even though a game-based approach has an inquiry episode, it doesn't mean that the whole of the lesson is an inquiry episode, because the lesson is episodic. It has an instructional episode. It has a management episode. It has a practice episode. It has an inquiry episode. So therefore, we see that the teaching is quite complex because teachers are deliberately, hopefully, deliberately selecting teaching styles or pedagogy based on the needs of the episode at that time in the lesson. Give you another example. This is a common example that is used in game-based, constraints-led instruction. It's a 3v1. The 3 X's are on the attack. They've got to beat the Y, which is the one defender. The task might be that they have to get a pass over the line to score. The teacher or the coach has chosen the subject matter: move the ball from one end to the other. Attacker, stop the ball moving, defend your line. The teacher has decided not only the subject matter, but the teacher has also decided the practice task. The teacher has provided cognitive setting by giving them the direction of what to do. the teacher will probably provide the aim of the game is to pass the ball over the opponent's line goal. So the thinking of the attackers. There's no instruction for the players to discover or create a new way of working together to get the ball over the line. So therefore, the verbal behaviour of the teacher is not in discovery. Really, the verbal behaviour is really implying to the students, given your existing movement toolkit, your knowledge and understanding, use that to get the ball over the line. Now, if discovery occurs, then it's not because it's been part of the direction of the teacher to do so, because when we look at the verbal script that is provided to the players are not being asked to create, to evaluate, to synthesize, to discover, to analyze. They're just being asked to do. At some stage, the players may be stopped, they may be questioned, they may be asked to reflect and consider. Now, in reflecting and considering, there is also no necessity to create, to discover. To reflect and consider could be retrieval of what you already know, do, and understand. So again, when we look to discover whether a teacher is using production pedagogy, which leads to exploration and therefore creativity, new understanding, the emergence of new ideas, we look to the verbs that the teacher is using because that provides the cognitive framing for the student when they go into that activity. And again, post-impact, the coach may provide feedback. The coach may use feedback through a question and answer. But again, that question and answer will be the students reflecting on their experience of the game in most instances. So again, it becomes retrieval practice of what they've just experienced. It's not a discovery episode. Let's look at another example. This is one that I've seen demonstrated in game-based approaches and a constraint-led approach. It's a game which has been around in cricket manuals for 100 years. Beat the V, hit the V. What we're doing is we're encouraging the batter to present full face of the bat and go straight at the ball. To frame that focus, we'll set a couple of markers out, which creates a V hitting zone. We'll give the instructions to the player that they can only score, or we might exaggerate the scoring to say, if you hit it anywhere else, we'll call that 1 run. If you hit it in the V, we'll call that 3 runs. If you hit it in the V past the marker, we'll call that 4 runs. So therefore, we've cognitively focused the player's behaviour by exaggerating expectation by giving a reward system. Have we modified the task of playing cricket for purpose? Absolutely, we have. Task modification is used in a behaviourist approach, a constructivist approach, an ecological approach. Have we conditioned the challenge? Absolutely, we've conditioned the challenge. We've created a V for them to hit in. The game conditions have been deliberately set to focus on a particular behaviour. Have we provided representation? Yes, anybody walking past that will go, oh yeah, they're playing cricket. It looks like cricket. It is cricket. So we are providing context or representation. Are we cueing their thinking? Absolutely we are. We have provided the focus to them. We have been explicit in the expectations. We haven't just said, here you go, have a hit of cricket. What happens when you present a full face of the bat? Unless we ask some questions, we don't even know if the player understands what presenting the full face of the bat means. If we say to them, do you know what presenting the full face of the bat means? And they give you an answer, that's retrieval practice, not discovery. Have we cognitively organised their behaviour? Absolutely we have. And not only have we cognitively organised their behaviour, we've also provided perception action coupling. So we can see that this activity can be explained from a constructivist perspective. It can be explained from an ecological perspective. From a pedagogical perspective, whatever backroom theory we use to explain it, the pedagogy ends up being exactly the same. The cluster of teaching styles ends up being the same. So for those of us that have been teaching for a while, when we hear new theories coming in, it's brilliant. Brilliant. I love the new theories. It gives me a new way of explaining the efficacy of what I'm doing. But having been teaching now and coaching for 35 years, often I go, but I've seen this pedagogy before. And I guess that's probably what makes me a little bit different. I'm not a coaching scientist. My work as an academic is very much focused on the pedagogy, and I serve theories. I serve theories as useful tools to provide an explanation for why that pedagogical selection does what it does for the learner. But I'll return now to the idea that most physical education curriculums around the world are underpinned by that constructivist perspective. And that's probably, I'm making a hypothesis here, because curriculum in general around the world is underpinned by educational science, which is informed by the science of the brain and how the science of the brain influences our understanding of learning, neuroscience. And what I understand of the neuroscience is that it tells us that players are actively analysing, evaluating, and synthesizing for activity in their environment. They are working with simple machines, compound machines, lines of force, angles, and geometry, which brings us back to the central importance for physical education teachers of good understanding of biomechanics. Players are continually stimulating their executive function while their brain is flooded with neural growth and stimulator compounds, because movement is not only good for the development of, let's call it very broadly, motor skills. Movement is essential for the wiring of the brain and for the brain to optimize its connectivity. But clearly our brain is not a computer, and the metaphor that many of us that have been around for a while, that the information processing model set up the idea that the brain is a computer and whatever we program in is what we get out. Clearly the brain is not a computer. If the brain was a computer, it would remember everything that it did. Just like every time we plug something into our computer and save it, it's there. If it was a computer, our moods, our environment, our energy level, our social context wouldn't affect our learning, because those things don't affect a computer. Our brain, using the idea that our brain is a computer is clearly erroneous as an analogy. But what we do know from neuroscience is that players that we might describe at the autonomous stage of learning have a brain which functions differently than players which are at the cognitive or the experimenting stage of learning. And we actually know that there are certain parts of the brain which fire up or don't fire up, depending upon whether you need to load up the prefrontal cortex to give attention to what you're thinking in order to build your movement toolkit, or whether this movement toolkit is now so habituated that the prefrontal cortex can be bypassed, and therefore you don't have the perception or awareness of doing the movement. You're at that autonomous or automated stage of learning. What science tends to be telling us now from a brain perspective is that automaticity is coming because the prefrontal cortex can be bypassed. What I find fascinating from our understanding of the brain is that the science tends to be settling on the fact that we predict the world and we act according to that prediction. So the brain as a predictor, and I don't want to use the term machine, but we don't have necessarily free choice, because the brain makes some predictions around what we should be doing, and then that influences our acting. And we're almost constantly hypothesizing and then acting on those hypotheses. What does that mean for us as teachers? Well, we build requirements for play from action goals to the context, whether we're looking at a constraints-led approach, and I see the information that is provided to set up how to play the game, and perhaps the expectations on the outcome that we're trying to achieve. We don't just go, here's a ball, here's a space, go and play. We provide an action goal. play this game and try to achieve this. This primed the player's thinking using information. So from an ecological perspective, we may call that an information constraint. From a cognitive perspective, we call that an advanced cognitive organizer. This can be achieved by a variation of what's called ability bias. We're anchoring the player's thinking, whether that's by providing an information constraint or whether it's using a different explanation as a cognitive organizer. We are anchoring that player's thinking. So coaches and teachers have decisions about what information they make available. And part of making that information available is the teaching style or the pedagogical choice. But regardless of skill acquisition theory that we may want to use, repetition with what I'm going to call focused attention is the key to driving that skill acquisition in physical education. So to finish off, back where we started, what is physical education? Physical education is that education in, through, and about movement, those three knowledge domains. Physical education is focused on developing the physically educated person. In understanding the physically educated person, I draw on the work of McAllister. A physically educated person has learned to arrange their lives in such a way that the physical activities that they freely engage in make a distinctive contribution to their long-term flourishing. My understanding of how we get that long-term commitment for their long-term flourishing is it actually starts with the emotional response to physical activity. That emotional response provides a connection to physical activity. That emotional commitment is stronger when we have what we might call psychomotor competence and psychological competence. Therefore, we have the competence that we can see this space and be physically active in this space, which gives us the confidence to then go into the space and do the physical activity. So competence plus confidence provides the opportunity to pursue physical activity for that long-term flourishing. Thanks again for the opportunity to come and have a chat today, and over to our hosts for question time.
Thanks, Shane. Absolutely fantastic. There's a whole series of questions that I have that I don't think we're going to quite get to in terms of managing your time as well. I do want to go, though, to the chat because Andrew Abraham has provided a series of questions as we've been going along through. So actually, Andrew, do you want to come on mic and I'll give you your choice of which one of those questions you're most eager to pose to Shane?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Hopefully you can hear me.
Loud and clear.
I won't switch my camera on. It'll hopefully the bandwidth will work. Shane, thanks very much. Really stimulating talk through it. You've given me some really useful insights into physical education. And I think that's really helpful because, you know, I was actually in Singapore last week, and not name dropping, of course, but there was someone from the education ministry listening to the talk, and he said, "What's the, is the similarities between coaching and physical education?" And I think my answer to him probably reflected some of the things you've been saying there, which is there are, but there are also differences as well. So yeah, so thanks very much for sort of putting my mind to rest with that. I'm going to go with the one around games-based approaches and problem-based learning. And actually, I think you started to answer this during the talk anyway, but do you see a comparison between those two things? And it was born out of reading some work where people were criticizing or critiquing at least the work of problem-based learning as being, is it the panacea that perhaps it was presented as being probably in the late 90s and early 2000s. So just your thoughts around that would be really much appreciated.
Yeah, I can provide if you send me an email, I can provide a conference paper to you where I provided the distinction between inquiry-based learning as a game-based approach and problem-based learning as a game-based approach. And they have different pedagogical structures, which would take too long to explain here because I am on a timeline to having to have a shower and get to work. But essentially, to your question, both have utility in a physical education class. If I look at the Australian context, problem-based learning suits really well our Year 9, 10 curriculum framework, which is about the capacity to take your existing experience and transfer it to the unknown or unfamiliar.
Like that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Shane. We've got, I think, time for maybe one more question before you go. So I'm going to...
Phil, I've probably got about 15 minutes before I need to sign off.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, excellent. In which case we are definitely going to make use of that time. So one of the bits that particularly interested me was your discussion of Arnold's ideas about knowledge in, knowledge through, and knowledge about movement. And in one of the previous episodes that we had with Jenny Coe and Nick Levitt, the comment was made that the characteristics of good teaching, which develops knowledge in movement, are those same characteristics that encourage the development of knowledge through movement. So the optimism, the persistence that you talked about. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that.
Well, not knowing what they said, I can see why what you've recounted is what they would say. Because in a sense, good teaching is good teaching. Good pedagogy is good pedagogy. So if we want the individual to be the constructor of the understanding, we will choose a similar pedagogical toolkit. So if we want the individual to understand their intra and interpersonal skills and take action to improve upon those, we need to use a pedagogical cluster that opens up, first of all, what we would call their using visible learning, making their current understanding of where they are at in these social emotional competencies visible. Having made their current understanding of these social emotional capabilities visible, we then move into scenarios where we stretch them and try to help them improve. So again, using convergent, divergent, guided discovery in order to take them from where they are in their understanding to a shape and a focus that is different, is the same as what we would use in a game-based approach for a movement toolkit, the technical and tactical capabilities.
Yeah, really nice. I'm keen to get through as many questions as I can, so I'm going to pass straight over to Ed Corlin next.
Thanks, Stu. Shane, that was really, really lovely and really neat. Some really good pedagogy in your own part in delivering that to us. So thank you. There's a few undergrad students of ours on here this evening who are engaged sport pedagogy students, and you mentioned at one point constructing the student as the more a capable learner, and that just really struck a chord with me. Can you give us a little bit more insight into what you mean about constructing the student as a more capable learner?
Yeah, maybe that was ineloquent. It's helping the student construct themselves as a more capable learner, ideally. If you don't understand the process of learning, it would be difficult to take action as a self-driven, self-motivated learner. If we go back to Mostyn's spectrum of teaching style, and we lay it out as a spectrum from A to K, where A, everything is under the planning direction and implementation direction of the teacher or coach, down to style K, where the player is making all the decisions at pre-impact about what it is they want to learn and how they're going to learn it. They are doing the impact set, they are doing the practice under their own pacing, timing, control, and direction. And the post-impact set reflection on how well did I go, they are managing themselves as well. That's self-teaching down at the other end. Understandably, when we're working with 4 and 5-year-olds in our physical education curriculum, we're probably drawing on more what Mostyn called reproduction cluster, because you don't know what you don't know. But over a 10-year journey, we've given our students sufficient capability that they can, if not be at style K, at least be heading towards being able to take more responsibility through direction and management of their learning. Specifically, for example, what we'll see in a lot of physical education classes in South Australia is the use of video. So the lesson is video. Just like if we're working in an elite junior sport program, the games are videoed. The student will watch their video. There will be some criteria, game performance assessment, to judge the performance in the game. The player will do the evaluation before they speak to their line coach. When they speak to their line coach, they are focused on what their performance improvement target is. So it's not a generalized conversation. It's what are we working on? What did we learn from the game against the criteria? That's happening in physical education, where the physical education games are videoed. The students are having to either in class in a PE theory lesson or for homework, look at that video, judge their performance against some form of criteria, set their performance goals, email them to the PE teacher or record it in their online journal that the PE teacher has eyeballs on. And then the next lesson, the PE teacher is having a focused conversation with that student on that student's self-determined learning goals. And the teacher is able to suggest modifications or shaping to it. But we're providing more self-determination and regulation and more responsibility for the learning outcome on the student. We can only do that in year 9 and 10 if we've progressively built that capability through experience and our progressive choice of changes in pedagogical emphasis from that 5-year-old beginning school to that 16-year-old that's in year 10.
Wow. Excellent. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Shane.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. There's a ton in there, and even in those answers, it was something you mentioned a few times in terms of when we look at reflection, it can either be retrieval or it can be discovery based. And I'd love if you could just expand a little bit more on how we maybe move away from retrieval towards discovery in terms of the coach-student or coach-player interaction or the teacher-student interaction, and what kind of practical things you can suggest that would help in that setting.
Great question. There's a couple of ways we can do that. First one, I'll draw on Mostyn's idea of guided discovery, which, you know, I erroneously describe game-based approaches as guided discovery simply because the teacher was asking the questions. So therefore the teacher was doing the guiding. And it was my colleague, Brendan Soucy, who came up to me at a conference and said, I reckon you game-based people have got this wrong. It's not guided discovery. Yeah, just because you're asking questions that guides their thinking doesn't mean it's guided discovery. You need to make a distinction between guiding their thinking and discovery as a cognitive process. I thought, wow, okay, that's really challenged me. So then we wrote this paper together called Reconciling Approaches, where we took a game sense approach and we looked at a typical game sense episode and we mapped it to Mostyn's spectrum of teaching styles to show that it's actually a cluster of teaching styles, not a teaching style. And it would only be guided discovery if the teacher had pre-planned a series of questions that takes the students from retrieval of what they know progressively towards discovery of something new. And in the design of those questions, the teacher has an anticipated answer. So they know using the metaphor, they know the ladder that they're taking the student on, because they've not only thought about the question, they've also, I need to get this answer before we move to the next question. And I need to get this answer before I move to the next question, which is Mostyn's definition of guided discovery. Again, I want to emphasize that retrieval practice is not bad, because I'm informed by Mostyn's idea that no pedagogy is bad. A pedagogy can just be used wrongly or for the wrong purpose or not matched appropriately to the outcome that the teacher or coach is seeking from the task that they're having their students or players do. So we may use our questioning deliberately for retrieval practice because we want to get insight, visible learning. What do these players know? What do they think they are capable of? But we need to have that visible learning as data in order to know what questions need to come in to shape and focus towards new understanding. So again, it comes down to that Alan Launder idea of P's of productive pedagogy, pre-test. That's not necessarily pre-testing as in giving them a closed skill environment and testing their movement capability, but we need to pre-test. Ask the question to get the data to know the starting point and then build from there towards the discovery.
That was excellent. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Shane. Our next question comes from Stephen Lavin. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Phil. Hi, Shane. Thanks for the presentation. Plenty of food for thought. Shane, I saw you tweeted recently regarding learning outcomes and the difference between actually giving them learning outcomes or a more effective way of kind of presenting learning outcomes to them before the lesson. I'm just wondering, could you expand on that a bit and how it fits into guided discovery, Shane?
Great question. So Learning Designer put out a blog on the central idea of the blog was that putting learning outcomes there to shape and focus the direction of thinking is a positive thing. Educational research tells us that one of the most powerful learning devices we have is explicit teaching. Now, explicit teaching isn't that behaviorist approach of telling everybody what they need to do, how they need to do it, and exactly what's good enough. But the explicit teaching is that idea of presenting to our students and our players at the start of the practice session, this is what we're doing it, this is why we're doing it, this is how it connected to the bigger picture. So we teach our students to explicitly have learning outcomes, know, do, and understand in those three areas. Because if we can't, as a teacher or coach, be explicit around what we want our players to know, do, and understand, there's no way we can have the players reaching it because we don't know it ourselves. So we make it explicit to the students in our PE classes, just as we would to our players. In order to find out whether the players actually really understand, have got at the end of the session, the know, do, understands, we turn it into a quiz. The learning designer said, perhaps there's merit in powering up thinking rather than give the know, do, understands as a series of statements. We actually do it as a quiz at the start. And through the quiz, we get them on the board. So again, we put the thinking load right from the start to the player rather than the thinking load at the end of the practice session with our inquiry, where we test how much the knowledge, skill, and understanding about the know, do, and understand has been developed. So in one sense, our exit strategy to consolidate the learning and test whether what we think the players should know, do, and understand is what they actually know, do, and understand as a consequence of the lesson. That provides us with great evaluative data about how impactful our training session was, as well as helping the players consolidate thinking, maybe putting them into a little bit of cognitive dissonance and stretch at the end as well, if that's what we want to do. We can do that at the start. Now, it doesn't become evaluative data for us if we do it at the start, but it does provide stronger cognitive framing for the players if we do it at the start. That was the central hypothesis of that blog.
Brilliant. Thanks, Shane.
That's great, Shane. Sorry. Go on, Ollie.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to jump in there and say we probably want to start to bring things to a close because I know Shane's got to get off and get ready for work, whilst some of us are probably also getting ready for bed as well. So, Shane, a huge thanks for your time this evening. It's really appreciated. Some great content in there, and I'm sure everybody will follow it on YouTube just to kind of review and reflect on it again. For those of you watching, our next episode is next Tuesday, the 5th of April at 6 p.m. and we'll have Professor James Rudd and Dr. Katie Fitton-Davis chatting about skill acquisition within primary school physical education. So a nice follow on from this evening's topic. Keep an eye on our Twitter for more information on how to register and watch. That's it from all of us. Bye.